Postgrad Chair in Global Media at the University of Colorado, Journalism and Mass Communication program. She was previously a professor and an administrator at many other universities. She's also a social scientist and was an advertising copywriter. She specializes in the political economy of media in developing countries, and today her presentation will investigate when, how, and how well the world's press covered the uprising and genocide in Darfur, Sudan. And finally,
so I study what journalists do and what they don't do, as Alan has so fittingly presented to us. Given time limitations, I'll go straight into the Darfur story. So what happened in Darfur? Why should we study Darfur? I do not have to tell this group why, but here's a current news report on the tragedy presently.
These are the survivors of the first genocide of the 21st century, still living in wretched poverty in refugee camps here in eastern Chad. It was right at the end of the winter of 2002 that the world first began to hear that there was something awful happening in western Darfur. It began as ethnic cleansing. People were being moved from their homes by horsemen. Everywhere they went, they left destruction. The people were known as Janjaweed. The word literally means hordes, and they came on their camels and horses and from the sky, not just killing and moving people on, but carrying out a campaign of systematic rape. Many of the women in these refugee camps have stories to tell of appalling acts of sexual violence carried out by the Janjaweed hordes against them. They moved out of Darfur in 2003 and 2004 into these camps where they're still stuck, and the international community seems unable to do anything about it. Now, what happened here was defined as genocide. That imposed duties on countries to act to try and do something to stop it. But despite that, and despite many peace talks and a large peacekeeping force now in Darfur, it has been impossible for the international community to provide enough security for these people to return to their homes in Darfur.
Alan talked about what difference the reporting makes, and would it make a difference? And so let's go to yes, I'd like to talk about this. Why do reporters do what they do? And why do social researchers like me study what they do? We're not naive. We understand that public information is only one component in the electoral democracy process. And as Mark said the other day, trials to address the possibility of punishment, prevention, and rehabilitation. And we assume that electoral democracies can use information presented in journalism to contribute to these possibilities: punishment, prevention, and rehabilitation. However, we're not naive. We understand that political will and business interests need to be on the same page. Otherwise, information alone does not make a difference. However, I do specialize in whether the information was there to convince political electoral democracies. So just for a second, I did not have this slide, so I will talk to you about our conception of news having a direct influence on electoral democracies. News is perceived by political decision makers, and news does have a direct relationship to economic power. But whether political power results in choosing punishment, prevention, or rehab depends on these dotted lines. From the public to political power, from economic power to political power. And so, yes, we are not naive. We understand that information has a complex relationship to political decision making. Now, the question I want to raise to you, publics around the world have known about the killing of 300,000 Darfuris and the displacement of more than 3 million by its own government. So I'm raising a bigger question for all of us to consider. Let's problematize the nature of the press. Who owns and operates the press? Whether and under what conditions it can cover some news or not. Alan poignantly showed us the role of individual reporters, but individual reporters are part of larger organizations, and larger organizations make profit and loss decisions. They make decisions like a cyclops, like Alan was saying. If the world's media can focus on Nelson Mandela's inauguration in South Africa, that's good. We don't need to be covering Rwanda at the same time. And so these are profit and loss making businesses, and they make choices. On the one hand, they make those choices, but on the other hand, we assume electoral democracies have some influence on world events, and those are not unrelated. So this is not a rhetorical question. How else would national electorates have known about the killing? I want you to really think about this. If the news media do not function to inform the world community, and that's on quotes, or national electorates, how else should that happen? And I will return to this. The question implicitly is, how do we entrust this public education, this humanitarian service to media firms who operate for private profit maximization around the world? They're not public interested humanitarian organizations. They are businesses. Somebody has to pay the bills at the end of the day. There are shareholders. And if not them, who else? Who will cover? There is no alternative to the press for public education. Once you leave high school or you finish college, the only way you know about situations like this is through the news media. And the news media are businesses at the end of the day. The model of advertising-based media evolved in the US in 1700s and 1800s and has been exported globally, especially after the 1980s. So what happened in the 1980s? In the 1970s, the OPEC oil price increased. I'm sorry if this is skunks. There's no clip. So that's all right. So with the oil price increase, countries around the world that used to invest in news organizations in the public interest reduced that funding. So you had India that used to have a state-funded broadcaster on the lines of the BBC, but not quite, decided that they couldn't afford it. State taxes would not be able to pay for this any longer. And so as a result, you have television channels and newspapers that are completely financed by advertising in India. In the US State Department and the US Information Agency, before it was abolished, there was this big emphasis on promoting advertising-based media as media that would have no state interest and therefore would more accurately report on events. But that's one side of the story. On the other side of the story is somebody who's got to pay the bills. We understand that news is presented to attract the eyeballs and ears of consumers. We call them target groups, target audiences, markets, market segments around the world. And that is the bottom line in terms of what gets out and what does not. So let's come to the specifics of the Darfur case. When did the world know about this? In 2003 and 2004. In 2003 February, parts of Darfur that were neglected by the Khartoum regime over 20, 30 years of independence only, decided that they wanted more of their share of development resources from the central government. And having tried to use the ballot box, they ultimately resorted to armed struggle and bombed a federal airport. So the book that my students and I did looked at how the world's media reported on this. From January 2003, for 26 months, we did a content analysis of how news organizations in the global north and south covered this. So the first question is, who knew? And when did they know? And you've seen an example from Alan's presentation, where he is at great pains to point out exactly in minute detail how people knew about Rwanda and the importance of the human interest story in presenting it. So when you look at this, within a month of February 2003 attacks, Egypt's Al-Aram government paper, which is next door to Darfur, covered this. And the BBC.com, which is far away, covered this. It was 2 months before Al Jazeera.net covered it. It was 6 months later where the English language daily, China Daily, covered it. Now, why would I pick on China Daily? Because there were Chinese oil workers in Sudan for at least a decade before this. China has a big presence in Sudan. China helps Sudan extract oil, and in return, weapons are provided to the Khartoum regime. Now, why would the English language China Daily cover it much earlier, a year earlier than the Chinese language People's Daily? And I will revisit this, but who is the audience makes a big difference in when the news gets covered. So we did a statistical regression to look at what were the predictors on who covered this first. And I will come back to this interesting fact that the audience determines it, not only the geopolitics of the ownership of the organization. 9 months later, South Africa's Mail and Guardian Online covered it. And it's only 1 year later that the UK printed press, the printed press in France, and the printed press in the US picked up the story. And it's a year and a half later that the Chinese language People's Daily picked it up. The Chinese language People's Daily and the English language Daily had the same Chinese reporters covering it from within the country. The information was available to the Chinese press service, the People's Republic, and they did not release it to the Chinese people. China is expanding into Africa considerably. You have a lot of Chinese laborers who are exported for jobs. The rural, unhappy, jobless villagers in China are being sent to parts of Africa to make more money than they would as farmers back home. And China does not want the story about what their progressive government is supporting in Khartoum. Now, the question is, okay, so varied in terms of the time, but how comprehensive was the reporting to enable a national electorate that is upset or aghast to pressure their national leaders? So we covered comprehensiveness of reporting. We also looked at how sustained was the reporting. Because the world's attention span is limited and the finances of a news organization are limited. Therefore, how sustained is the reporting? Is it a flash in the pan? Was there in-depth coverage? Was there a story like Alan Thompson's story that went and did a news feature on this and was rewarded with $5,000, okay? So that is an investment for a news organization to make. So how many news organizations went in depth beyond just the hard news that you can get from the wire services? How many news organizations covered the why? Very often the news says what happened, where it happened, when it happened. But explanatory journalism is very limited. So we wanted to know whether people understood why this happened. Why did the Western region? We talked about it yesterday in terms of the geography of it. But what was happening in the Western region over generations that caused this to happen? And why did Khartoum put down the genuine demands by the West of Sudan for development assistance? And why did Khartoum then take recourse to paramilitary groups? And then what kinds of remedies were addressed? Finally, we were interested in what sources were used. The research on media studies of reporting show it's government sources that are privileged always, within the North America, within Western Europe, and around the world. And therefore, I wanted to know, were sources used from the victim's point of view, like Alan talked about, or were they always beginning with President Bashir said? So we designed a comprehensiveness index with 130 points on it. And from the 10 news organizations I studied, the BBC.com and the Washington Post did the most comprehensive coverage. And I do not have time to give you the breakdown of how the index was formed, but the book has all of those details. The Mail and Guardian Online of South Africa covered it again. The New York Times and Al Jazeera. These were the top performers in the 10. And you will notice that, interestingly, except for the Mail and Guardian Online of South Africa and Al Jazeera, BBC, Washington Post, and New York Times were Western news organizations, which are frequently criticized for not covering the global South. So 6 out of 10 news organizations got failing grades. If we look at the 60% we use for our own students here, and who passes and who fails, I would say that 6 out of 10 news organizations failed on the comprehensiveness index score. And all 10 news organizations covered the why least often, compared to the what and where. Now, how to improve comprehensiveness coverage of humanitarian crises in these financial times? This is what I want you to take away from this, not the specifics of this one study, but ask yourself, okay, given the dire financial straits that news organizations are in, and given that there is no alternative in terms of public information, what are the options? And then, of course, that's a question that I would like all of you to take home. What does what good does public information alone do if national and international organizations do not have the political will and the legal instruments to act? This is something I had asked Joaquin, how can we address this? Because assuming public information is available, then what influence does that have in terms of the UN and in terms of national regimes? How am I doing on time? I do? Okay. Well, and I would like to, 5 minutes? Wonderful. I'd like to share some specific data with you. So you might say, okay, what happened in terms of sustained reporting? All around, the government-owned newspaper next door consistently provided short reports on what was happening. And you might say it's just next door. It had to, because refugees were streaming into Egypt. They had to explain to their public why these refugees from Darfur were coming in. And then the BBC was another source of consistent reporting on the Darfur crisis. Now you would say, why the BBC? And this is because of the old colonial relationship, but in addition, the BBC does very sustained coverage of all kinds of issues, whether they have been former colonial powers or not. Now, the why. I mentioned that very few news organizations took the time to have reporters on the ground or do historical studies online of what happened and why this crisis took place. And the Washington Post, interestingly, was the highest in terms of including attention to the why of the coverage in their reporting. And yet, Al Aram, that was next door, and did sustained what and who and when, did not have the guts to cover the why, because it would offend the Khartoum government if they talked about the neglect of the Darfur region by Khartoum. And Egypt's press laws say that you cannot offend a friendly government. Therefore, they could not talk about the crimes against humanity being committed by the al-Bashir regime. The kinds of causes really depends on the relationship of the news organization to the country being covered. And I looked at 4 predictors of news coverage. What is the geopolitical historical relationship between the country where the news organization is located and the country where the event is taking place? Then I looked at the current relationship between those countries. Then I looked at who owns the news organization, which is state-owned or privately owned. And then I looked at the predictor, which was who is the audience? Even if it's state-owned or privately owned, who is the audience? And traditionally we have found that the national interest of the country consistently predicts in foreign news how an issue is covered. However, in this case, what we found was that the nature of the audience, whether it is domestic or foreign, makes a big difference also. Multiple sources. Did the news organization speak with the voice of the victim? No. For the most part, the sources that were interviewed were always the Khartoum regime. Very few people covered the victims in Darfur, and you would not be surprised to know that those who covered it were Al Jazeera for the most part. So each news organization then covered Darfur with its own distinct lens. This is not a new finding for press researchers. We know that we sometimes think that the press is a mirror and it just reflects what's happening on the ground. That's not the case. The press is a societal, human business institution, and it refracts events based on its own interests as an organization. So each news organization makes strategic, systematic, and predictable news construction decisions. News is constructed, it is manufactured. It is not a reflection of what happens on the ground. So sure, high national interest, oil and water, had a big influence on how Darfur was covered. The audience or market had a big influence, and ownership had a big influence. Our contribution was really looking at the role of the audience and market. That was a major difference that other foreign news studies have not reported.